Galatians 1:17 is one of the most understated sentences Paul ever wrote. He is making an extended argument about the origin of his gospel, that it came directly from Jesus, not from any human teacher, not from the Jerusalem apostles, not from anyone who could have trained him in the established tradition. He is making this argument because people in the Galatian churches are questioning whether his gospel is legitimate, whether he received it from qualified sources, whether his authority to teach is real. He responds by reconstructing his biography. He lists what he did not do after his conversion. He did not consult any human being. He did not go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before him. What thou? And then, almost in passing, he lists what he did instead. I went into Arabia. No explanation follows, no description of what happened there, no account of what he did for the time he was there. He mentions Arabia the way you might mention an intersection on a route you are describing, as a fact of geography, not a subject worth dwelling on. Then he says he returned to Damascus. And then, after 3 years, he went to Jerusalem. 3 years. Between the most dramatic conversion in the history of the early church and the first meeting with the Jerusalem apostles. 3 years of silence, most of it spent in a place Paul never explains, and Luke, writing the book of Acts, never even mentions. What did Paul do in Arabia? Why there? Why 3 years? And why does the New Testament say almost nothing about the most important period of theological formation in Christian history? Read Galatians 1:11-18 carefully, because the sequence Paul establishes is precise, and the precision is the argument. He says he received his gospel by revelation from Jesus Christ, not from any human, not as a tradition handed to him through a chain of teachers. He received it the way the Hebrew prophets received their words, directly, not through an established transmission process. He then describes his former life as a persecutor of the church, his zeal for ancestral traditions, the violence he carried out against communities of Jesus' followers. He was advancing in Judaism beyond many of his contemporaries, he says. He was serious, committed, and wrong. Then God, who had set him apart before he was born and called him by grace, revealed his Son to him. And here is what Paul says he did immediately after that revelation. Nabataean. He did not consult flesh and blood, the Greek phrase meaning human beings, not human sources, human teachers, human authorities. He did not go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before him. Instead, he went into Arabia. After some unspecified time in Arabia, he returned to Damascus. The return implies he had been there before. The conversion happened on the road to Damascus, and Damascus was the city where the immediate aftermath unfolded. Then, after 3 years, he went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas, Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. He saw James, the Lord's brother, and no one else of the apostles. The sequence is the argument. Revelation to Arabia to Damascus to 3 years to Jerusalem. Paul is establishing for the Galatian churches that no human being shaped his gospel before it was fully formed. He did not go to the people who could have taught him. He went somewhere else first. Arabia is the middle of that argument, and it is the part he never explains. Modern readers who hear Arabia picture the Arabian Peninsula, the vast deserts stretching toward the Persian Gulf, what is now Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the wider Middle East. That is not what Paul meant. In the 1st century, Arabia referred primarily to the Nabataean kingdom, a sophisticated Arab trading empire whose territory covered what is now southern Jordan, the Negev, or the Sinai Peninsula, and parts of northwestern Saudi Arabia. Its capital was Petra, the city carved from rose-red sandstone cliffs, one of the great architectural wonders of the ancient world. Temples, tombs, colonnaded streets, a theater, a sophisticated water management system, not empty desert. A living city of perhaps 30,000 people. The Nabataeans were merchants who controlled the major trade routes connecting Arabia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean world. Petra sat at the intersection of those routes. The kingdom was ruled in Paul's time by King Aretas IV, who reigned for approximately 50 years and is the most well-documented Nabataean king in ancient sources. The Nabataean kingdom had significant Jewish communities integrated into its commercial networks. Jews lived in Nabataean cities, operated in Nabataean markets, maintained synagogues in Nabataean territory. For Paul, who consistently approached Jewish synagogues first in every city he entered, these communities would have been natural audiences. Paul's Arabia was Petra's Arabia. Organized, populated, administratively sophisticated, with an audience ready to hear what he had to say. Here is the detail. Most discussions of Paul's Arabia. Years pass over without stopping. 2 Corinthians 11:32-33. Paul is listing the hardships he has endured in service of his gospel, the beatings, the imprisonments, the shipwrecks, the dangers from rivers and roads and false brothers. And among this catalog of suffering, he includes something remarkable. In Damascus, the governor under King Aretas had the city of the Damascenes guarded in order to arrest me. But I was lowered in a basket from a window in the wall and slipped through his hands. King Aretas, the Nabataean king whose territory Paul had spent time in, whose governor, the ethnarch, the official responsible for the Nabataean community in Damascus, wanted Paul arrested badly enough to post watchers at the city gates. Ask the question this detail raises. Why would the Nabataean authorities want to arrest Paul? Paul was a Roman citizen. Arresting a Roman citizen without Roman authorization was not a casual undertaking. Roman citizenship carried legal protections enforced by the empire. For the Nabataean governor to go to the trouble of guarding the entire city of Damascus, stationing people at every exit, to prevent one man from leaving, suggests that Paul had done something significant enough to make the Nabataean administration want him in custody. The sequence in Galatians 1 points to what that something was. Paul went into Arabia. Paul returned to Damascus. The Nabataean governor was waiting. What had Paul done in Arabia to generate official opposition from the most powerful political figure in the Nabataean world? The Aretas connection points toward one answer. Paul had been preaching in Nabataean territory. His message about a crucified Jewish Messiah was provocative enough, or had generated converts prominent enough, to attract the attention of the royal administration. What? This means the Arabia period was not a quiet personal retreat. Paul was doing something active enough to make official enemies in an organized kingdom, something that followed him back to Damascus in the form of a governor's arrest warrant. Here is a literary puzzle that deepens the mystery. The book of Acts is the primary narrative history of the early church. Luke traces Paul's movements in remarkable detail, which cities he entered, which synagogues he preached in, which converts he made, which riots he caused. Acts 13 through 28 is essentially a travel diary of Paul's missionary activity, city by city, incident by incident. Statici. Acts says nothing about Arabia. Luke records Paul's conversion outside Damascus. He records the immediate preaching in Damascus, the escape over the wall, the visit to Jerusalem, and then he moves forward into the missionary journeys without pausing to account for 3 years that Paul himself says were spent in Arabia. This is not a small omission. 3 years is more time than Paul spent in most of the cities Luke records in detail. 3 years in a sophisticated kingdom with Jewish communities and trade routes connecting to the Mediterranean world. And Luke leaves it out entirely. Why? The most plausible explanation is that Paul's Arabia years were not organized mission activity of the kind Luke was recording. They were something more interior, more personal, less amenable to the narrative style of Acts, which records arrivals, speeches, responses, and departures. Whatever happened in Arabia did not have that shape. It was not a story Luke could tell in the way he told Paul's other stories, which may mean that what happened in Arabia was formation rather than mission, revelation rather than proclamation, the private interior work that produced the public theological voice, and which leaves almost no external trace, precisely because it happened inside one person, between that person and God. Paul's account in Galatians and Luke's account in Acts create a specific tension around the immediate post-conversion period. Acts 9:20. At once he began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God. Galatians 1:16-17. After receiving the revelation, Paul says he did not consult any human being and went into Arabia. At once versus Arabia. The accounts are not necessarily contradictory, but they emphasize different things. Acts focuses on the immediate public activity in Damascus. Galatians focuses on the deliberate withdrawal from human consultation. Scholars have harmonized these accounts in several ways. Paul may have preached briefly in Damascus, then gone to Arabia for the extended period of formation, then returned to Damascus and resumed preaching with greater depth and provocation, which would explain both Luke's at once and Paul's Arabia period. The Aretas connection supports this. Paul's troubles with the Nabataean governor came after the Arabia period, when he had returned to Damascus, not immediately upon conversion. What both accounts agree on is that something happened between the Damascus road and Paul's first Jerusalem visit that changed him from a persecutor into the most theologically sophisticated writer in the New Testament. The Arabia period is where that change was processed, whatever shape the processing took. Now look at what Paul himself says about Arabia's geography in his letters. Galatians 4:24-25. Though Paul is building a complex argument about the two covenants represented by Hagar and Sarah, and he inserts a geographical note. Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia, Mount Sinai in Arabia. Paul knows the geography. He has thought about it carefully enough to deploy it as a theological point in a legal argument. He knows that Sinai is in the territory he refers to as Arabia. Now consider the pattern this channel has traced across multiple videos. Moses went to the mountain of God at his defining moment, Sinai, where the Torah was given. He climbed the mountain, received the law, came down with his face shining. Elijah went to the mountain of God at his lowest moment, Horeb, the same mountain, where the still small voice spoke and he was recommissioned. He traveled 40 days to get there. At the Transfiguration, both Moses and Elijah appeared on a mountain with Jesus, each of them representing, as this channel explored, the full weight of the Hebrew Scriptures, bearing witness to the one they had always been pointing toward. Paul went into Arabia. Paul knows Sinai is in Arabia. Paul had just received, he says, a direct revelation about the relationship between the Old Covenant and the person of Jesus. And Paul goes into the region where the mountain that defines the Old Covenant stands. Did he go to Sinai? He does not say, but a man who has just received a revelation about Jesus as the fulfillment of the covenant given at Sinai, who knows that Sinai is in the region he is traveling to, and who will later write with extraordinary precision about the meaning of that mountain. It is not unreasonable to ask whether he stood at its foot. If Paul went to Sinai, the theological weight of that visit is almost too large to measure. He would write in Galatians 3:24 that the law was a guardian, a custodian, a pedagogos, until Christ came. In Romans 10:4, that Christ is the culmination of the law. In 2 Corinthians 3, that the glory on Moses' face was a fading glory, being brought to an end, a ministry of condemnation, giving way to a ministry of righteousness. Paul's entire theological contribution is built on the relationship between the Sinai covenant and the new covenant through Jesus. The law is real. The law is good. The law points forward, and the law is no longer the basis of righteousness because the one it pointed toward has arrived. Now imagine that Paul, fresh from his encounter with the risen Jesus on the Damascus road, traveled to the mountain where Moses encountered God and received that law. Not to receive the law, Moses had already done that. Not to be recommissioned from crisis, Elijah had done that. But to stand at the mountain where the old covenant was given and work out, in the presence of God and without any human consultation, what it meant that the old covenant had just been fulfilled. Moses came down from Sinai with the law in his hands and the glory on his face. Paul may have come down from Sinai with the conviction that the glory on Moses' face had been pointing, all along, toward the permanent glory he had seen on the Damascus road. Whatever the truth, Galatians 3-4's extended meditation on the law, Sinai, and their relationship to the gospel of Christ reads like the work of someone who has spent considerable time thinking about that mountain. The reason the Arabia years matter theologically is this sentence: I received it not from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. Paul is talking about his entire theological framework, his understanding of justification by faith, the relationship between law and gospel, the inclusion of Gentiles without circumcision, the cross as the resolution of the law's demands, the resurrection as the basis of all hope. All of it, he says, came by revelation, not from the Jerusalem apostles, not from Ananias, who baptized him in Damascus, not from any human chain of transmission. The Arabia period is the gap in which this revelation was received and consolidated. 3 years between the Damascus road and the first Jerusalem meeting. And when Paul arrives in Jerusalem, his theology is not a work in progress. He stays with Peter for 15 days. He sees James and no one else. He is not sitting under their instruction. He arrives as a theologian with a fully formed gospel, not as a student seeking formation. Whatever happened in Arabia produced that readiness. If the 3 years between Paul's conversion and his first Jerusalem visit, the gap Luke doesn't mention, the period Paul barely describes, the most important formation period in the history of Christian theology, is new territory for you. This is what this channel is for. We go back to the original text and read what is actually there. Subscribe if this kind of material is useful to you. And if you know someone who has read Paul's letters without ever pausing at Galatians 1:17, send this video to them. That one sentence raises the most interesting question in the history of the early church. Paul is not a shy writer. He is the most self-revealing author in the New Testament. He tells the Galatian churches about his public confrontation with Peter in Antioch, an incident that reflects badly on both of them. He tells the Corinthian churches about the thorn in his flesh, the visions and ecstasies, the times he was uncertain whether he would live or die. He tells the Philippian church about his imprisonment and the genuine uncertainty he feels about the outcome. He does not protect his dignity at the expense of the truth when the truth serves his argument. And yet he says almost nothing about 3 years in Arabia. He mentions Arabia to establish where he went, because the geography proves his argument that he did not go to Jerusalem. He mentions the Aretas incident in a different letter to establish the cost of his early ministry. But he never describes what he did in Arabia, what he experienced there, what he understood at the end of those 3 years that he had not understood at the beginning. The silence is itself a piece of data. Paul's letters are selective in a specific way. He reports what serves the argument he is making. He does not report for its own sake. The Arabia period, apparently, did not serve any argument he was making in the letters that survived, which could mean one of two things. Either what happened in Arabia was too personal and interior to be useful in a letter. Formation is not the same thing as mission activity, and the inner work of receiving a revelation is not easily narrated in the genre of apostolic correspondence. Or what happened in Arabia was so fundamental to everything that followed that Paul did not see the point of describing the foundation. You do not describe the foundation when you are building the house. Some are. The Arabia years were the ground everything else stood on. Paul did not write about them for the same reason architects do not include the bedrock in the architectural drawings. Romans 15:19-23. Paul writes, "From Jerusalem all the way around to Illyricum, I have fully proclaimed the gospel of Christ, and because of this, I have been hindering to come to you. For I have been always striving to preach where Christ was not known. But now, there is no more place for me to work in these regions, no more place." From Jerusalem to Illyricum, roughly the eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans, Paul considers the work complete. He has, in his understanding, covered the territory. Is the Nabataean kingdom in that coverage? He was there for 3 years. The Aretas incident suggests he was not simply passing through. He was doing something provocative enough to generate official opposition from the most powerful figure in the region. Did Paul plant churches in Arabia, churches in Petra, in the Nabataean cities along the trade routes, in the communities he preached in before the governor's men were sent to watch the Damascus gates? If he did, those communities left almost no trace. There is no letter to the Nabataeans. There is no reference in the later letters to congregations in Arabia. The churches Paul planted in the Aegean world, Corinth, Ephesus, Philippi, Thessalonica, survive in the correspondence because Paul had ongoing relationships with them, because problems arose that required letters, because his investment in those communities was sustained. Whatever communities may have formed in Arabia during those 3 years did not generate the same kind of ongoing pastoral relationship. Perhaps they were absorbed into the broader Eastern Church. Perhaps they did not survive the political upheaval that followed. Perhaps Paul himself moved on too quickly to establish the kind of foundation that would produce correspondence. But somewhere in the Nabataean kingdom, in the years between 32 and 36 AD, there may have been people who heard Paul preach before anyone in Corinth or Ephesus had heard his name. People who received the gospel in its earliest form, directly from the man who received it directly from Jesus. In the 3 years before Paul's public ministry began in earnest, we do not know their names. Paul never mentions them. Luke never records them. When Paul arrives in Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion, something is already fully assembled. His 15 days with Peter are not an apprenticeship. There is no record of Paul sitting under Peter's instruction, asking questions about the historical Jesus, taking notes on the traditions of the Jerusalem community. Peter is the one who spent 3 years with Jesus in person. Paul is the one who received his gospel by revelation. They meet as equals in different ways, not as teacher and student. Within a decade of that visit, Paul will publicly confront Peter in Antioch over behavior that contradicts the gospel. The incident recorded in Galatians 2:11-14, where Peter withdraws from eating with Gentiles, and Paul calls this out in front of everyone. Paul does not defer to Peter's seniority. He challenges him on the basis of a gospel principle that Paul holds as firmly as any principle he carries. That conviction was formed in Arabia, the justification by faith that runs through Galatians and Romans. The law as custodian pointing toward Christ, the inclusion of Gentiles without circumcision, the cross as the end of the law's condemnation, the resurrection as the foundation of all hope. These convictions appear in Galatians, one of Paul's early letters written when the missionary work was still in its first decade, with a confidence and completeness that does not read like a theology still in development. Paul did not arrive at his theology gradually, through decades of reflection and revision. He arrived at it in Arabia, and when he came out the other side, he knew what he believed, and he was willing to defend it against anyone, including Peter, including the Jerusalem establishment, including the Galatians, who were tempted to trade the gospel he had preached for a different version. Paul says, "I went into Arabia." He says it once, in the middle of an argument, to prove he did not go to Jerusalem. And then the Arabia years remain unexplained in everything he ever wrote. Unexplained by Paul himself in 13 surviving letters. Unexplained by Luke, in a history of the early church that records Paul's movements in minute detail across 20 years of mission work. Unexplained by any early Christian writer who had access to Paul or his companions. 3 years. The Nabataean kingdom. Possibly at the foot of the mountain where Moses received the Torah. Almost certainly doing something controversial enough to warrant the Nabataean governor stationing guards at the gates of Damascus. Possibly in communities that heard his gospel before Corinth or Ephesus had heard his name. The silence Paul keeps about Arabia is not the silence of embarrassment. It is the silence of someone who has told you what you need to know, the geography, the timeline, the principle, and considers the rest too personal or too fundamental to narrate. He went into Arabia. He came out with a gospel. 3 years passed in between. Nobody knows exactly what happened in that gap. The Aretas incident tells us Paul was active. The Sinai reference tells us Paul knew the territory's theological significance. The fully formed theology in his earliest letters tells us the Arabia period produced something irreplaceable. What he said after Arabia fills most of the New Testament. What he did during Arabia is the one thing he chose not to say. God bless you. Subscribe.